What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
At my graduation dinner, my sister stood up and announced her engagement. Then she looked right at me with that little curl at the corner of her mouth and said that her news probably overshadows my small achievement, and everyone, including the people who had been posting proud family messages about me all day, laughed in that easy way people laugh when cruelty is dressed up as a joke, and I kept my face steady while I counted my breaths and told myself that the next morning she would open the mailbox and scream at what I had sent. I wish I could tell you I handled it gracefully in the moment, that I made some clever toast and turned the room in my favor, but I sat there smiling the kind of smile that cramps your jaw, because I know my family and I know exactly how the conversation goes when Rachel wants attention, since we have been playing this same game since grade school, where I do the work and she brings a bigger story, and the adults call it timing, and I am told not to be dramatic. The ring went around the table like it was a holy object, and people pretended to weigh it in their hands, and my father asked how he was supposed to afford all this when he was still recovering from the last winter's repairs. And then he shot me that look that says be a sport and let your sister have her moment, as if I had asked for applause, as if I had not been happy sitting in the back until the smirk landed like a thumb on a bruise I have carried for years. Rachel leaned into the bit with the confidence of someone who has never been told no, talking about guest lists and venues and the short timeline because she does not like to wait, and when an aunt asked whether the proposal happened tonight, Rachel laughed and said it was a few days ago, but tonight felt right for the announcement because she wanted the whole family together, and the table actually cheered at that, like she had done something selfless and not something calculated and petty. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, which is what happens when I am deciding whether to walk away or stay and memorize every detail, and I chose to memorize, because people like Rachel depend on the world forgetting what they do, and I am done forgetting. So I watched who congratulated first and who avoided my eyes and who pretended to care about my diploma while angling to be first on her bridal shower team, and I filed all of it in that quiet part of my brain where I keep the things I might need later. You know how families will reassure you after a public sting by saying that you are overreacting, that she did not mean it, that it is just how she jokes. And how those same people will text you in private to say they saw what you saw, but they cannot get involved because peace is more important than truth, and how you learn to swallow that because peace buys you a little comfort, until it does not. I reached that point somewhere between the second round of toasts and my mother whispering that this might be a good time for me to say something nice to my sister about how proud I am. So I stood, and I did say I was happy for her, and I meant it in the most literal sense, because I am happy when people reveal themselves so clearly that even the ones who prefer not to notice have to decide what they are willing to defend. And then I raised my glass to the room, thanked everyone for showing up for dinner, and sat down, because sometimes restraint is not surrender, it is aim. After the check was paid and the hugs were done and the car doors closed, I drove exactly 2 blocks before pulling over to breathe and to stop my hands from shaking. And then I called a person whose number I had saved months ago when a casual conversation at a coffee place turned into a story that sounded like a warning. And we talked very calmly about dates and names and the kind of receipts that do not disappear when someone deletes a post, and by the time I started the engine again I knew exactly what I needed and exactly where to get it. Back at my apartment, I opened a drawer where I keep an ugly little box that holds the things I do not want to look at often, but refuse to throw away. And I added to it the copy of the program from the dinner and the napkin where Rachel had written the date of her engagement like a signature, and then I printed out what I had collected over the last hour and what I had already tucked away from earlier months. Not because I planned for this night, but because when you grow up as the rehearsal and someone else grows up as the show, you learn to document what people call coincidences. I wrote her name on an envelope, and I wrote her address with the same careful handwriting she used on my bedroom door when we were kids, and she labeled it with a name that still stings, and I slid the stack inside without a note. Because a note invites an argument, and I am not interested in arguing. I am interested in truth that speaks for itself, and I sealed it and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight that was not heavy in any physical sense, but carried the balance of everything I had swallowed at that table. Then I drove to the 24-hour drop at the main post office because I wanted it moving before anyone in my family finished their late-night debrief in the group chat where I am always tagged second. And I fed the envelope into the slot and listened to it slide out of reach, and I walked back to my car with my phone on silent and the kind of calm that comes when you are done asking for fairness. And as I pulled away, I pictured Rachel opening the boxy little mailbox by her front door in the morning with that same smirk ready to go, and I pictured the moment the smirk would falter, and I let myself enjoy the thought for exactly 3 breaths before I told myself to focus on sleep, because tomorrow would be loud. By the time I got home after dropping the envelope, the adrenaline had cooled into that strange clarity that shows up only when you are done begging people to be decent, because once you stop trying to negotiate respect, you see the patterns in high definition. And for me, the pattern was boring in its predictability. Since Rachel would make a scene, my parents would call it personality, relatives would look away because family peace is a convenient blanket, and I would be expected to swallow and smile and maybe send a thoughtful follow-up text to prove I was the bigger person, which, if I am being honest, I have done more than enough times to qualify for an invisible medal I never asked for and never wanted. It started long before the dinner, long before the ring was passed around like a party trick, back when we were kids and the house ran on the rule that Rachel felt things loudly, and I was supposed to interpret that as sincerity. While my quieter reactions got labeled as coldness or moodiness or some character flaw that could be fixed if I learned to laugh along, and every holiday turned into a stage where my work became the warm-up for her performance, with the adults telling me that timing matters and that when good news lands you do not compete, you celebrate, which would have sounded fair if anyone had remembered to celebrate me when my news landed first. When I got into a program that scared me because it meant years of work and very little sleep, I told the family chat, and my message sat there under a photo of Rachel holding a cocktail, which earned a storm of replies about the cute glass and the cute top and the cute whatever, and when the replies finally landed on my announcement, they came with polite applause and immediate questions about whether Rachel would be visiting my city soon, because everyone would love to plan something around her schedule, and I learned right then that attention is a currency in families like mine, and I was going to have to stop lending mine at zero interest. There was the time Rachel forgot rent and used my name to ask our aunt for a loan because she thought I would not mind, since I was the responsible one, and then she laughed and said she was just testing whether our aunt really loved us both the same. And when I tried to set a boundary, my mother called and said not to be dramatic because family helps family, and I remember standing in my tiny kitchen with a stack of textbooks leaning against the toaster, thinking about how help has a way of looking like theft when it is demanded instead of requested, and how I had become the person everyone counted on because I never made them feel the cost, which was my mistake and not a virtue. As I sat at my small table that night with the printer humming and the envelope sealed and the clock rolling toward morning, I thought about Rachel's fiancé and the coffee shop conversation that put his last name in my phone months earlier. And I felt something I have not let myself feel in years, which is not rage and not triumph, but the simple steadiness that comes when you finally accept you are not crazy for noticing what you notice, and that if people are going to insist on acting without shame, you are allowed to act with strategy, because strategy is what you owe yourself when fairness has left the building. Here is something I never advertised because I knew it would turn into another chore if I said it out loud, but I am the account holder on the family phone plan, the one I opened in college because of a discount that made sense back when every dollar counted. And my parents promised they would take it over and never did, and Rachel once joked that I should keep her line forever because I owe her for all the personality she brings to gatherings, which was said with a grin that makes people call her charming, and I nodded and changed the subject because I had finals and a job and no bandwidth for another argument about bills and burdens. Yet the truth is that the account has always been mine and the power to end the favor has always sat there under a password only I know. So I logged in and looked at the lines and the extensions that felt like little ropes tied to my ankle, and I scheduled a transfer for her number that would push a clean handoff at sunrise, which meant no dramatic cut and no revenge for revenge's sake. Just a tidy message that told her to set up her own grown-up plan, and to me it felt less like punishment and more like returning something that should never have been on my plate, because people who brag that they're the star of the family do not get to live on someone else's discount and then mock that person's success as a minor event. Not on my watch and not ever again. I wrote a short note to my parents that said the phone plan was moving to new ownership and that I would share the transfer codes if they wanted the account, and I hit schedule on that email for the same morning window as the mailbox delivery, not to be dramatic, but because timing is the only language my family respects, and if Rachel wanted to make my graduation dinner the stage for her grand announcement, then the morning could be the stage for a quieter lesson where bills pay themselves and receipts tell their own stories without me raising my voice at all. When I finally stretched out on the couch and stared at the ceiling, I told myself to stop rehearsing what I would say if Rachel called me names or if my mother accused me of ruining a happy week, because the point was not to win a debate. The point was to stop playing. And as sleep tugged at the edges of my thoughts, I pictured the moment she would step to her mailbox with that same smug curve in her mouth, and I pictured the pause as she felt the shape of the envelope and then checked her phone to call someone and saw the transfer notice waiting for her, and I realized I did not need her apology to feel whole. I only needed the sound of a lock turning on a door I should have closed a long time ago. Which is exactly why I whispered goodnight to the quiet apartment and let the morning come, because the next move was already in motion and the scream would not be the only thing echoing down her perfect little street. Sleep did what it always does when the body gives up before the mind does, which is to shut down the noise just long enough for the brain to line up the facts in a row like dull little soldiers. And when I woke before the alarm with that steady drum in my chest that is not panic and not excitement, but the middle place you reach when you stop asking for permission, I knew I should probably feel guilty for putting a match near the family powder keg. Yet the truth is that nothing I gathered was stolen or twisted or taken out of context, because receipts do not delete themselves and people who count on charm to clean their tracks forget that paper has no interest in charm. Which is why I trusted the envelope more than I trusted any speech I could have made at that dinner. You asked me once why I had that number saved from the coffee shop months ago, and I said it was just a feeling, but the longer version is that the woman who gave it to me, whose name is Jamie and who recognized my sister's fiancé the way people recognize a tune they cannot stand, told me that she had watched her former roommate fall for the same smile and the same promises and the same little inconsistencies that make you feel like a nag if you ask a straight question, and she told me there were deposits paid to vendors who never delivered because the vendors were never real, only shell names meant to float money through places you cannot easily track unless you know where to look, and she said she had emails, screenshots, and a dated contract that turned into a small claims case when the man they both knew as Evan decided the breakup made him not responsible for anything he had set in motion. I did not run with any of it then, because I am not interested in living like a detective unless somebody drags me into the alley, and I figured Rachel would make her own choices and face her own results. But the dinner turned the alley into a stage with my name on the program as the background act, which is when I went back to my drawer where I keep things I do not enjoy but might someday need, and I pulled out the card with Jamie's number and I called. And we did not gossip, we traded dates. And while we talked, I opened the county records site that anyone can use if they have patience and a willingness to spell last names correctly, and I found filings that matched the vendor names Jamie had listed. And then I checked the Secretary of State site and saw a dissolved company registration that lined up with one of the email domains I had seen on Evan's business card at a barbecue last summer when he told me he was a builder of boutique experiences. Whatever that means when the invoices say something different. The thing about timelines is that they look like puzzles until you draw the line, so I drew it from the previous engagement that ended abruptly in late spring, to Rachel's engagement that was apparently a few days old, to the deposits that fell into the crack between those 2 points and did not land where they were supposed to, and then I drew another line from the date stamps on messages Jamie forwarded. Messages that were not romantic or incriminating in the way tabloids love, but practical. In a way that made my stomach turn, as in discussions about moving money between project accounts and paying down one bill with another, and I thought about the ring that went around the table and the laugh that went around with it, and I felt that old heat in my face. Not because Rachel might be hurt by the truth, but because she had taken a moment I earned and fed it to a story that may not even be real in the way she thinks it is. What went into the envelope was not a confession written by me, because I am not writing confessions for anyone, but a plain stack of copies with dates and amounts and case numbers and a simple index page. Because I know my sister and I knew she would deny what she could not absorb in one glance, which is why I made the first page a map and the rest a road, and if she chose to ignore the road, that would be her decision. But at least she would not get to say nobody told her where it led, and while I taped the flap, I realized that this was not vengeance dressed as virtue, it was a mirror with a shipping label. Because I have lived long enough in this family to understand that people pretend not to hear what arrives softly, I set a second timer that had nothing to do with the post office and everything to do with accountability. And I drafted a calm email addressed to Evan's public work address, the one printed on his card and listed on his site, with 3 lines that asked for clarity about overlapping timelines and deposits recorded under his name. And I scheduled it for the same morning window, and I added a short note that if he preferred to answer by phone, he could call me, which sounds generous until you notice the clock. Because I also set a separate message to go to my parents that morning with a tidy explanation that the family phone plan was moving off my account and that Rachel's line would require her attention that day. And I scheduled all 3 to land like a short row of dominoes that did not need me to breathe on them to fall. I know there are people who will say this is petty, that I should have pulled my sister aside and pleaded with her to take a harder look at the man she calls her future, but pleading is what you do when you think someone will hear you. And I have a decade of proof that my words do not land when her story is playing, so I chose not to perform concern for a crowd that prefers the sound of applause, and I chose instead to let the boring weight of documents carry my side of the conversation. And as I watched the draft sit quietly in the outbox, I felt a calm I had not felt in years, because for once I was not chasing their approval with baked goods and explanations. I was setting the table with facts and leaving the room. The sun was just starting to push at the edges of the blinds when my phone buzzed with the first delivery confirmation, and I had the strange thought that I should make coffee before the day turned into a courtroom, but I did not move, because a second ping landed. And then another, and I imagined Rachel at her little mailbox with the flag still down and her thumb already hovering over her screen to post something cheerful about bridal plans, when her eyes hit the name on the return address and then the thick block of paper that does not feel like a card, and at the same time I pictured Evan watching his phone blink with my email as his name sat in the subject line next to the word timeline. And I realized that the scream I had predicted might not be the first sound I heard, because the first sound might be the call I had timed for myself, the one I could hear starting to buzz as the third domino tipped. Morning arrived with the blunt efficiency of a clerk stamping forms, because once the scheduled things started to fire there was no poetry left in any of it, only the small chimes of confirmation and the longer vibrations of incoming calls. And I lay there for a breath too long before deciding that if I answered anyone it would be the person who signed his name on the documents that made my stomach twist, which is why I let my mother's number roll past and my father's number roll past and even Rachel's number roll past until the screen showed Evan and a subject line in my inbox flipped from queued to sent, and then I picked up with a hello that probably sounded too calm for a morning like this, while he cleared his throat and asked, with that quick laugh men use when they hope to disarm you, if this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed out privately, preferably before rumors made their way into places that were, in his word, sensitive. I told him that the only sensitive thing in my hands was a stack of dates and amounts that lined up in ways he would find hard to explain to a woman planning a ceremony who believed she was the first person to wear that ring this year. And I told him that I had no interest in performing outrage or composing monologues, that I had simply mailed documents to the person who needed to see them most. And if he wanted more context, he could check the index page I had highlighted and follow the numbers like stepping stones, and there was a long stretch of silence while I imagined him scrolling with his mouth set in that tight line people get when they realize the audience has changed, and when he finally spoke it was to ask who else had the packet. And I said only Rachel for now, and then he asked me, almost politely, to give him a day to speak to her before anything went wider, and I said the day had already started and that my cooperation ended at truth, which is not a performance and not a negotiation but a door that opens the same direction no matter who is standing in front of it. While we were still on the line, my phone blinked with a text from a neighbor who lives on Rachel Street and who knew about the dinner, because families are small towns no matter how far you move. And she wrote that she had just heard a sound that was not a cry for help exactly but not laughter either, and that it came from the porch with the black iron mailbox and the potted plant Rachel moves around for photographs. And I do not pretend that I did not feel something like relief when I read that. Not because pain is pleasant to watch, but because recognition has a sound and sometimes it is louder than shame, which is what you get when the story you sold yourself collides with a record that does not care for your plot points. Before I could respond, my screen lit with my mother's name again, and this time I answered because I could hear the message in the ring itself, and I knew if I did not pick up she would keep calling until the entire day belonged to the effort of not speaking. And she went straight into the script about ruining happiness and humiliating family and why I could not just let my sister have her night. And I said that Rachel took the night and did not settle for it. She took the week and the calendar and the budget and called it destiny. And I could hear my father in the background asking what this phone plan email meant and why did his number say pending instead of ready. And I said very evenly that the account was moving and that I had carried it longer than any reasonable person would, and that today was as good a day as any to correct what should have been corrected years ago. Which is when my mother's voice changed from righteous to wounded, and she asked how I could do this to family. And I said that returning unpaid tabs to their owners is not cruelty, it is literacy. Rachel finally got through after that, and she did not start with hello. She started with an accusation that I had doctored paperwork because only a jealous person would dig up old filings and sew them together to look like fraud. And she said the venue had just called to ask about a deposit that did not match their ledger because they received a letter flagged for the billing office with a list of vendor names and dates that did not exist in their system, and I reminded her that she had bragged about the venue by name to 3 different relatives at the table, and that bragging is not a crime, but it is an invitation for verification. And if a venue prefers to know who is using its name on invitations before a real contract is signed, that is not my problem and not my invention. It is a business doing its job, and I suggested, as gently as I could manage, that she read the first page of the packet again before calling anyone a liar. She pivoted to anger the way she always does when the first story fails, and she said our parents were devastated and that I had made them look like fools in front of relatives who were already on edge about money. And I said the relatives were always on edge about money because money was treated like a passing storm instead of a set of choices, and that I had spent years keeping umbrellas over heads that did not belong to me, and that I was done with that small mercy that only produced bigger messes, and she said she would fix it, and that I was spiteful, and that I wanted to be the center of attention, and I said if attention looked like this she could keep it, because I wanted a quiet life with my name on my bills and my achievements allowed to stand without being annexed, which is not glory, it is dignity. Calls kept coming after she hung up, some from relatives speaking in slow, careful tones that tried to sit on both sides of the fence, and I thanked them for their care while declining to offer extra details, because the point was not to feed gossip. The point was to stop lying to myself about the rules of this family, and while I closed my laptop and set my phone face down, another small timer turned over in the back of my head, the one I had set when I mailed a second certified packet. Addressed not to Rachel and not to my parents and not even to the venue, but to the person who signs off on Evan's licenses and filings, a person whose office does not love surprises and keeps very clean records. And as I reached for my keys, I told myself that I would not celebrate and I would not crow and I would not even let the word victory into my mouth until I heard whether that last delivery landed. Because there is a difference between a confrontation and a conclusion, and my day was not built for flames. It was built for a switch that flips so quietly you only notice the light when it refuses to go back out. By midday, the day had stopped pretending to be normal, because after Evan's first call and my mother's script and Rachel's accusations, the quiet part of the plan finally stood up and did exactly what I built it to do, which was to move without my voice attached to it. And the proof that it worked arrived not as a victory trumpet, but as a bland email from a state office with a subject line that used phrases like preliminary review and licensing inquiry and temporary restrictions pending. Clarification, which is the sort of bureaucratic poetry that makes most people glaze over, yet to me it sounded like a seatbelt clicking, because once a board sends a letter with case numbers and deadlines, venues stop taking promises over the phone and banks stop waiving fees for charming smiles, and people who thought they could float get told to sit down and document. Evan called again with a tone that tried to be reasonable while tripping over itself, saying he just needed a little cooperation because he was juggling transitions and former obligations and the kind of messes that look worse than they are on paper. And he called me by my first name like we were teammates who had stumbled together into an unfortunate misunderstanding, and I told him that my role ended at mailing copies and asking a single clear question that he could answer with dates rather than adjectives, and that if his work was as clean as he kept telling every cousin at every barbecue, then a board full of people who read filings all day would be delighted to confirm it. And I reminded him that if Rachel had to hear hard things, it would be better to hear them now instead of 3 days before some deposit deadline turned into a public scene, and he exhaled in that heavy way people do when they meet a boundary they did not anticipate, then thanked me for my candor in a voice that made thank you sound like a diagnosis. My parents arrived at my door without asking, because even when your child is an adult there is a habit of acting like proximity equals authority, and my mother started with what she always starts with, which is a mourning tone for the family we pretend to be. And she asked if there was not some gentler path I could have chosen where Rachel's face would not be on fire and our relatives would not be whispering about timelines and deposits, and I said gentler paths had been my specialty for years. And they had led us in circles that kept me tired and kept Rachel untouchable, and that I had not created the ledgers or the filings or the names on the contracts. I had simply drawn a straight line through them and let the line speak. And my father asked whether I understood the cost of humiliating someone you love, and I said that the cost of protecting a lie is a bill I was done paying, and then I handed him the transfer codes for the phone plan and the printed instructions that would let him take over with 2 signatures and a single call, because I wanted there to be one thing in this day that was easy and clean and made it impossible to pretend I had acted from pettiness rather than from an exhaustion that finally learned to use a calendar. Rachel came later, not storming but vibrating with that furious composure that can crack glass if you stand too close, and she told me that Evan had said everything was explainable and that I had turned explainable into scandal. And she said the venue had placed a hold and that his license email had attached words she did not understand and did not want to understand. And I said I could not translate what the board wrote because they had made it so clear that even a person who hated paperwork would get the point, and she asked me if I had done it to win, and I told her I had done it to stop losing, and that if she wanted a path out I had left a folder on the table with a simple timeline of a list of whom to call, and a pre-filled small claims packet with fields she could adapt if certain refunds did not arrive, which made her look at me like I had slapped her and hugged her at the same time, because nothing is more offensive to a person who lives on drama than an organized exit. The conversation tilted when I told her the one thing I had not said out loud yet, which is that the envelope had a second purpose that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the fact that I knew she would throw herself in front of a moving train rather than admit she had stepped onto it willingly. So the index page was written for an audience of one with a list of steps that, if followed in order, would place a bank warning on any charges under the dissolved vendor names and freeze withdrawals that were scheduled to skip across accounts like flat stones, and if she wanted to pretend I had ruined her week she could do that later. But if she wanted to keep her parents' money from evaporating she needed to stop arguing with me and call the fraud desk with the exact phrases printed in the margin, because yes, I was angry, and yes, I had been humiliated. And yes, I would not tolerate another smirk at my expense, yet underneath all of that I still wanted her to have a way out that did not require me to carry her while she learned to walk. She asked why I would help after all of this, and I said because I am done being the person who cleans up and gets erased, and the only way to be done is to make a clean exit that leaves no excuses behind. So when people sit at tables years from now and rewrite this week into a myth where I was cruel and she was pure, there will be a thick, boring trail of documents that outlast every story told over drinks, and I will not be at those tables to argue. Because I have places to be that do not require me to prove I deserve a chair. The day ended not with a shouted apology or a dramatic embrace, but with a quiet that felt earned, because after Rachel left with the folder and the codes and a face that finally looked like it belonged to a person rather than a performance, I took the spare key to my parents' house off my ring and set it next to my diploma on the counter, and I sent one message to the family chat that said I was hosting a small dinner 2 evenings from now for anyone who wanted to celebrate a graduation without a spotlight theft, and that there would be no speeches, no smirks, and no bills left on my account, and then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and sat with the hum of my own apartment. And I realized that the loudest part of revenge is not the scream from a mailbox or the gasp when a board letter lands. It is the silence after a door closes and refuses to open for the same old nonsense. Which is exactly the sound I had wanted to hear since long before the ring went around the table, and now that I had it, I did not need an audience to clap, because the plan had ended exactly where I meant it to end, with the truth doing the loud work and me finally, mercifully, off stage.